Good evening. I hope all of you are doing great. Tonight we are learning Maseches, Yoma, Daf, Nun Aleph. And we're starting 4 lines from the top with the words Ula Rav Sheshes, 4 and 5 lines. On the previous blot, we learned a brisa where we compared the status of Tamura to the world of Korbanos. And we isolated the fact that the Korbanos was dealing with a specific Korban. And one of the possibilities of that specific Korban that we saw in the name of Rav Sheshes was that that animal was the Ayal Shel Aaron and not the Par. So says the Gemara, piggybacking on that, starting right from there. Well, the Rav Sheshes, according to Rav Sheshes, Adamokim lo be'elo shel Aaron, who in that brisa that I just mentioned, established that the Zevach was speaking about the Ayal Shel Aaron. If that's to be the case, why wouldn't he have used another option that checked off all the boxes? Lukma bePesach, it should have been a reference to the Korban Pesach. After all, both of them, the Ayal Shel Aaron and the Korban Pesach, fulfill the following requirements. Tidoches HaShabbos, the Korban is done on Shabbos, and Ve'es HaTuma, and it's done when the Kohen is Betuma, and as well, the Osa Tmura, the Korban Yachidhu. And it's done as a Tmura because it's a Korban Yachid. As mentioned, the Tmura cannot be done with its Korban Ziur. So why then did Rav Sheshes feel compelled to say that the Ukimta of the Brisa, that the word Zevach, when comparing Zevach to Tmura, that the Zevach was referring to the Ayalo Shel Aaron, when it could very well have been speaking about the Korban Pesach? So to this, the Gemara answers, Kasavar, or 6-7 lines down, Nun Aleph, Amud Aleph, Kasavar, and Shochten es Pesach halayachid. The Korban Pesach that's brought is always done b'chabura, and the way that we basically describe this is that it's effectively b'shutfis. It's basically done in partnership, and therefore it's not considered to be a Korban Yachid, and therefore this brisa, which is speaking about a Korban Yachid, can't be the Korban Pesach. Asks the Gemara a brilliant question. If that's true, then v'nukma b'Pesach Sheni. We learned in Maseches Psachim that there's a Korban called Pesach Sheni, and the Pesach Sheni is given in a number of circumstances. The primary one is that when a person who on Pesach Rishon, on Yud Daled Nisan, is Betuma, when if I were to have been in Betuma on Yud Daled Nisan, I would not be allowed to bring the Korban Pesach, and therefore I'd only be allowed to bring that Korban on Pesach Sheni a month later. Now, when the Korban Pesach is brought on time, it's brought b'chabura, b'shutvis, it's brought in a group. However, when it's brought on Pesach Sheni, it is brought as a Yachid. And then the Korban Pesach on Pesach Sheni checks off all the boxes. And now our question against Rav Sheshes is still stronger. Rav Sheshes wanted to say that the Zevach, the Korban we were speaking about in the Brisa we learned yesterday, was talking about the Ayalo Shel Aaron. But there's another Korban, the Pesach Sheni, which checks off the same exact boxes. So why then did Rav Sheshes not want to pick the Pesach Sheni Korban? And there the Gemara answers, Midachi Tuma? The Korban, the Pesach Sheni, is it going to be Doche Tuma? We'll learn about this a little bit more, but the short version of this question, which seems rhetorical at the moment, is that if the whole reason why the person couldn't bring the Korban Pesach on Pesach Rishon, if the whole reason why he couldn't give the Korban is because he was Tameh, so then by Pesach Sheni, we're going to bring it Betuma, that's a contradiction in terms, of course not. And therefore, Rav Sheshes only was willing to entertain the option of the Zevach and the Brisa we learned yesterday to mean Ayalo Shel Aaron, and not what the Gemara is now suggesting as Pesach Sheni, even though in general it checks off most of the boxes, but it doesn't check off the box of the Korban being brought Betuma. That would not be allowed. Now the Gemara is going to give a sophisticated approach to rejecting this. Here we go. We're about a little bit more than a third of the way down. Nun Aleph Amud Aleph. Amar le Rav Huna bered Rav Yeshua l'Rava. Rav Huna bered Rav Yeshua says to Rava, Vitana, when we learned the brisa yesterday, a different brisa, all these brisas are going to weave together slowly but surely, because yesterday it was a significantly difficult Gemara with a lot of different pieces. So here the Gemara says, Vitana, Maishna Pesach the Karla Korban Yachid. Why is it that by the Korban Pesach, he referred to the Korban Pesach as a Korban Yachid, the Korban of an individual? Umaishna Chagiga the Karla Korban Tzibur. I mean, at the end of the day, every Jew has an obligation to bring a Korban Pesach, and every Jew has an obligation to bring a Korban Chagiga. So why was one of them referred to as a Korban Yachid, the Korban Pesach, and why was one of them referred to as a Korban Tzibur, namely the Chagiga? If you want to say it's because, well, the reason why we referred to it as a public Korban, the Chagiga as a public Korban, is because it's broad with throngs of people around, and it's okay. really technically it is a korban yachid, but we call it a korban tzibur because there's so many people around. Well, if that's true, but Pesach nami asi b'knufia, then Pesach, which in the Brisa was identified as a korban yachid, that's also brought b'knufia. It's brought b'chabura. There's thousands of people. We had isruchag to make sure people had time to get in the korban. So you shouldn't have differentiated based on that. So says the Gemara. After all, we could make a distinction in this Mishnah, this Brisa, which indicates that Pesach is brought b'yachid. Maybe it's not talking about regular Pesach. Says the Gemara, Ika Pesach Sheni de lo hasi b'knufia. Maybe when this Brisa said that the Korban Yachid, that the Korban Pesach was a Korban Yachid, and the Chagiga was a Tzibur, and the way we would understand it is that as follows. When that Brisa references Pesach, it's referencing Pesach Sheni, which Taka is a Korban Yachid. It's not brought b'knufia, it's not brought b'shutfus, it's brought by one person who, due to the fact that he was Tameh on Yud Daled Nisan, is now bringing it on Yud Daled Iyar. Fine, that makes perfect sense. And the Korban Chagiga is brought b'knufia, then everything is kaftor b'ferach. Maybe that Brisa was really talking about Pesach Sheni. Omar Le Rava says back to Rav Huna Breder Rav Yoshua. He says, Im kein yehei doches haShabbos v'satuma. If that's true, then we should have a scenario whereby it's doches haShabbos v'satuma, namely that the Pesach Sheni should be doches Shabbos, which it's not, and it should be doches tuma, which it's not. Or is it? Says the Gemara that Omar Le Rav Huna Breder Rav Yoshua pushes back against Rava and says, it actually is the case. What does it mean it is the case? Take a look at this. Command de Omar Dachi. You're right. Our Mishnah, which references Pesach as a Korban Yachid, is referencing Pesach Sheni. And yes, that Korban Pesach is Dachi Tuma. Where do we see this Shita, which is a very unique Shita? Says the Gemara, 6 lines from the bottom of Nun Aleph Amud Aleph, says the Gemara as follows. The Tanya, the Brisa writes, Pesach Sheni doches haShabbos ve'eno doches hatuma. This is not the shita we need. This is the shita of the Tanna Kama and the Brisa. And here the Brisa writes that Pesach Sheni is done even on Shabbos. If Yud Daled Iyar falls out on Shabbos, so be it. The korban will be brought on that day, the Pesach Sheni korban. This Tanna Kama is of the opinion that but ve'eno doches hatuma, that if it cannot be brought when a person is betuma. However, and this is the shita that's going to be the clincher for our understanding of this Brisa. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, af doches atuma, very mechudash. Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that the korban Pesach Sheni is not only brought on Shabbos, but it's also brought betuma. My time of the Tanna Kama. What's the reason why the Tanna Kama by Pesach Sheni writes that it's doches Shabbos, but it's not doches tuma? So says the Gemara, a svara, a beautiful, simple svara. Amar lach, the Tanna Kama would argue, mipnei tuma dachisu. The whole reason why we pushed off from the first time is because he was tamei. Tuma dachisu, he was pushed off from the first korban Pesach because of tuma. V'yaseh betuma. And now on Pesach Sheni, when you have the opportunity to bring it, we're going to bring it betuma. The whole reason why we didn't bring it in the first place was because you were tamei. Now it's Pesach Sheni, he's tamei, we'll let it go. No, it doesn't make any sense. Otherwise, you could have brought it on Pesach Rishon. So the Tanna Kama has a svara issue with saying that this korban could be brought betuma. He says it doesn't make any sense. If the whole reason why you pushed off from Pesach Rishon is because you're tamei, now that you're tamei by Pesach Sheni, of course you should not bring it. However, Rabbi Yehuda, 2 lines from the bottom, what would Rabbi Yehuda say? Rabbi Yehuda would say, Amar lach, Amar kra, kichol chukas ha-Pesach ya'asuo. So that's what the pasuk says, that by Pesach Sheni, all of the rules of Pesach apply to it. Says the Gemara, v'afilu betuma, that it could even be brought betuma. What does this mean? HaTorah hechzira alav la'asoso betara. The Torah does require, ideally, that when he brings the Pesach Sheni, that it's done betara, lo zacha. What if he didn't merit to being a tahor at that time? The halacha is ya'asenu betuma, a huge kula of Rabbi Yehuda, that we would allow the Pesach Sheni to be brought betuma. And what the Gemara does here is it accepts another possibility for what the Zebach was talking about. Let's summarize what we've learned so far. 4 to 5 lines down, we learned the Shita. We learned again the Shita of Rav Sheshes, that when the Brisa refers to a Zebach, it's referring to the Ayalo Shel Aaron. The Gemara says, why not Pesach Sheni? And the Gemara concludes that actually Taka could be Pesach Sheni, according to Rabbi Yehuda, because we need to check off the following boxes in the Brisa. We need it to be something that is Doches Shabbos. We need it to be something that is done Betuma. And we need it to be something where the mechanics of Tmura actually work. And that only applies in the case of Ayalo Shel Aaron, that's Taka true, but it even applies in the case of Pesach Sheni, not within the Shita of the Tanna Kama, who doesn't allow that korban to be brought Betuma, but within the Shita of Rabbi Huda, who says on the very last four words, lo zacha, if you don't end up being tahor, then still, if you're tummy, it doesn't make a difference, yasenu betuma, and that answers that part of the Gemara. Turning to the top of Nun Aleph Amud Beis, we're going to head to the top of Nun Beis Amud Aleph, I think. Yeah, we're going to head to the top of Nun Beis Amud Aleph, 3 lines down. Let's continue. Says the Gemara, seemingly out of the blue. That's why we have Rashi. The tepu clay. Maybe we could learn out from somewhere else. What are we talking about, Bichlal? Take a look at Rashi. So Rashi's highlighting something that we learned last night. What does Rashi say? Dibur hamaskal the tepu clay. He says, Boya de Rabbi Lazar de La'el. The par Yoma Kippurim da kohanim bekufi hu de miskaprebe. Yesterday, we learned within the Shita of Rabbi Lazar that we asked in regards to the par of the Kohen Gadol, does Tmura affect it, which is in effect asking the question of whether or not this korban is a korban tzibur or a korban yachid. And the Gemara explained that really the other Kohanim are a part of this korban bekufia. What does it mean, bekufia? So we highlighted yesterday in Rashi that yes, they get some type of kapara, but they're not one and the same with the Kohen Gadol. So then the Gemara says as follows: why didn't we understand this shita of kufia? Why didn't we understand this from another Marimakom? The tepu clay, maybe we should understand what Rabbi Lazar understood, that the Kohanim, the Echav HaKohanim, all the Kohanim who are not Kohanim, who are not the Kohen Gadol, that he gets kapara bekufia. It's only as a secondary that these people get kapara, but they're not really exactly like the Kohen Gadol. Why didn't we learn that from the pasuk in Chumash that says the Asher Lo Amar Achmana? The Torah says that it is his, namely that when the Kohen Gadol purchases the par Yoma Kippurim shel Kohen Gadol, it has to be with his own money. So it says the Gemara, Mishalohu, maybe he has to bring from his own cash. Titania, second line down, Nun Aleph Amud Beis, the Brisa writes Asher Lo. The pasuk says Asher Lo, that it has to be his. Mishalohu, maybe this is the basic din that a Kohen Gadol needs to buy the par Yoma Kippurim with his own money. The Lo Mishal Tzibur, he cannot use funds from the Tzibur. It has to be his. Yachol Lo Yavi Mishal Tzibur Shein Tzibur Miskapern Bo. Maybe this first par, where only the Kohen Gadol and Echav HaKohanim are going to get kapara. So maybe we should say that Lo Yavi Mishal Tzibur Shein Tzibur Miskapern Bo. They don't get kapara with this one. However, Aval Yavi Mishal Echav HaKohanim. Maybe we should argue that with the first par, that the other Kohanim are able to participate financially. Shaharei Echav HaKohanim Miskapern Bo. Talmud Lomar says the Gemara, no, that under no circumstances can anyone fiscally participate in this. It has to be completely owned by the Kohen Gadol. Talmud Lomar, the second time the Torah says the words Asher Lo, we've already seen it once, it's written the second time to say Asher Lo, that indicates that no, even Echav HaKohanim, who by the first par are going to be part and parcel of the kapara, they are not allowed to participate financially. Yachol lo yavi, maybe taka, it's true that they should not participate, the Echav HaKohanim, v'im hevi kasher, but if in fact they did participate and then the animal was brought, it would be kasher. Talmud Lomar Shuv, the pasuk says for the third time, Asher Lo, Shina HaKasuv Alav Le'akev. We know based on 3 different explicit references to the words Asher Lo that it has to be his. Number 1, the basic din that the Kohen has to pay for the part. Number 2, that Echav HaKohanim should not participate. And number 3, that even if they do participate, but it does not work. It's le'ikuva, the par is a 0. It doesn't give anyone kapara. Says the Gemara, what do we see from here? What we see from here is the idea that Rabbi Lazar expounded yesterday, which is that the Echav HaKohanim get kapara bekufia only on the back of, only in a secondary form to the Kohen Gadol. That's very clear from here that they're secondary because the pasuk says Asher Lo 3 times, and the Brisa completely excludes the Echav HaKohanim from being owners, from being fiscal partners in this par Yom Kippurim. So that seems to be very clear, but asks the Gemara as a retort. But if that's true, if what you're saying is true, that Echav HaKohanim are not allowed to participate financially, then Echav HaKohanim, ilav dekanu begaveh, if they don't buy in, if they don't purchase, if they don't buy into the par, how then do they get kapara? Doesn't make any sense. The only way to get kapara is if you bring a korban. But if you're not the one bringing the korban, because the pasuk says Asher Lo 3 times, and the Kohen Gadol has to buy the par Yom Kippurim with his own kesef, with his own money, and the Echav HaKohanim are not allowed to even participate, even le'ikuva. So then how do they get kapara? How does the whole thing work? The mechanics are not in place. There's no way the Echav HaKohanim could get kapara if it's not, as the Gemara writes, the kanu begaveh, if they haven't bought in. Says the Gemara, Ella, it must be that shiny Bei Gaza de Aaron. It must be that the Bei Gaza, this is a reference to the ownership of Aaron, is different to Afkare Rachmana Gabe Echava Kohanim. This is a din d'oraisa, a unique din d'oraisa. What's the unique din d'oraisa? The unique din d'oraisa is that even though it's true that the Torah says 3 times and explicitly, and the Bryce is explicit that only the Kohen Gadol can be the one who puts funds down for the partial Yom Kippurim, even though that's true, but there's a gzeras hakasu that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is mafkir. He makes free for the taking. Really, it's really just done in a way where the Echav HaKohanim can participate. It's afkare rachmana gabe Echav HaKohanim. That's the mechanics here. That you're right that the Kohen Gadol is the only one who lays out any money, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu made it in the mechanics of this korban that even Echav HaKohanim get kapara, and that is bekufya. Hachanami. So it's not just true by the case of par, but it also goes back to the question Rabbi Elazar asked about Tumura, and that is how the Gemara answers this question to say that there is something exceptionally unique about the Parsha Yom Kippurim, in that the Kohen Gadol is the only one who could put money down, and even though the other Kohanim were not Kanu Begaveh, they did not invest any money, they had no fiscal ownership whatsoever, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu was mafkir elements of the Parsha Yom Kippurim in order to generate kapara for the Echav HaKohanim. This brings us to the new Mishnah 1/3 of the way down. And Aleph and Beis, let's continue. The Kohen Gadol would be walking through the Heichal ad shemagia lebein shtei parochos hamavdilos ben hakodesh uben kodesh hakodashim uben ama. So the Kohen Gadol, after the par and after all the kapara, would walk the length. He would be going from east to west toward the Heichal, and he'd be walking. And as we will see soon, in one of the Batei Mikdash, there were 2 parochos. They would be like kind of over. Let me do it like this. They're kind of overlapped like this, and the Kohen would have to walk around one to get into the Kodesh. But they weren't, and there was an amma space between them. We'll see why momentarily. There's an amma space between them, and there was an opening at one end. We'll see which end, machlokes in the Tanaim. There's an opening at one end for the Kohen to weave in, and then he can get around into the Kodesh around each curtain. So each curtain didn't go the whole length of the wall. The one that was closer to him went most of the way, let's say all the way up to the north side, and then he'd wrap around the opening, go all the way down to the south side of the second curtain, and then he'd be able to get in. Fine. So that's what the Gemara says here in the Mishnah, and that's the sheet of the Tanakama. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Lo haisa sham ela paroches achas. I disagree. Bilvad. There was only one paroches. There were not 2 parochos. Shene'emar v'hivdila haparoches lachem bein hakodesh uvein kodesh hakodashim ufurish pasuk in Chumash. Does it say parochos? It says paroches. So says the Gemara out of the gates here. An excellent question. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yossi, you really brought your A game. Says the Gemara, Shapir ka'amar lehu Rabbi Yossi l'Rabbanan. He brought a pasuk in Chumash. It says paroches. So what are you even arguing, Rabbanan, that there were 2 parochos? The pasuk says paroches. Of course, there's only one paroches. Says the Gemara, hold on. The Rabbanan, what would they say? Halfway down, the Aleph on the base. Amrei lach, they will tell you, Hani mili b'mishkan. This was true in the Mishkan as the Jews traveled. Aval b'mikdash sheni, but in regards to the other 2 Batei Mikdash, we had some unique features going on. Number 1, in Mikdash Sheni came in the lo havoi amatraxin that used to be in Mikdash Rishon that they had an amatraxin. What's an amatraxin? Instead of the curtains, they had a 1 amma thick wall. That's what they had. The kedusha of that wall, we were not sure about. We didn't know if the thickness of the wall was part of the regular heichal, or if the thickness of the wall had the higher level of kedusha of the kodesh hakodesh, and we didn't know. In the Beis HaMikdash, the building was taller, and because it was taller, it couldn't handle the weight of the amatrax, and so they didn't have one. They put up a paroches instead. Over Mikdash Rishon, hu dehavoi. In the Mikdash Rishon, they did have the amatraxin. V'istapka lehu l'rabbanan b'kedushasei ikilifni mikilachutz v'avud shtei parochos. So here's the history lesson. In the Beis HaMikdash Rishon, there was a thick wall, 1 amma thick, a 1.5 thick wall that separated the Heichal from the Kodesh HaKodashim. In the second Beis HaMikdash, it was a taller height to cover, and because it was a taller height, it was nearly impossible to build the wall to have it stand. So what they did is they didn't build a wall; they just put up a paroches. But because there was a machlokes as to whether or not that 1 amma thickness of the amatraxin, when it existed in the Mikdash Rishon, as to whether it had the kedusha of the Heichal, the less holy, or the kedusha, the thickness of the wall of the kedusha of the Kodesh HaKodashim. So the Chachamim said, "You're right. The pasuk pasuk in Chumash says you only need one paroches, but we need to put in two because we don't know where the kedusha lies, and we can't just put it in the wrong place. It has to be in the right place. So what they did is they put one paroches closer to the heichal side with one opening at the top or the bottom, and then you'd walk through that first one, and then you'd wrap around the other paroches, and then you'd be in the kodesh hakodashim. So that's what the Gemara says. And therefore va'avud shtei paroches. Good. Says the Gemara as follows: Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught us, Beina mizbeach lemenorah haya mehalech divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda was of the opinion that the Kohen Gadol would walk between the mizbeach and the menorah. The menorah was on the south side of the heichal. When you look at a picture in front of you, and on the left side is the kodesh, so then the south side would be the bottom. That's where the menorah was. And the Gemara says that he'd walk between the mizbeach and the menorah. So that means the mizbeach's in the middle of the room, and he'd walk. If this were the mizbeach and this were the menorah, the Kohen Gadol would walk on the lower half, on the southern half, in between the menorah and the mizbeach. That's how he would walk. That's the shita of Rabbi Yehuda. Rav Meir Omer no, bein shulchan lemizbeach. He'd walk above the mizbeach, in between the mizbeach and the shulchan, which was on the northern wall. So shita number 1, Rabbi Yehuda, he walked below the mizbeach. Shita number 2, he walked across the heichal above the mizbeach. And now shita number 3, v'yesh omrim bein shulchan lekosel. No, the third shita is he'd walk, as we saw previously, the shulchan was offset from the northern wall just a little bit, and there was enough space for the Kohen Gadol to walk by. So this third shita in the Tanaim, in the Brisa, says, V'yeshomer ben shulchan lakosel, he'd walk up against the northern wall, in between what was at the northern wall, which is the shulchan, but it was slightly offset from the top, and he'd walk above it. So we have 3 shitas. Above the menorah, below the mizbeach, closer to the southern wall. Above the mizbeach and in between the shulchan, about 2/3 of the way up on the page. And then on the third shita was the yesh omer, is that he walked above even the shulchan, above all of the kelim, up against the very top wall, the very northern wall of the heichal. Says the Gemara, man yesh omrim. Who is the shita of this yesh omrim? Amar Rav Chizda, Rabbi Yossi. This is the shita of Rabbi Yossi. Da Amar Pischa b'tzafon kai. So now we're getting into the nitty gritties. He says that in the second Beis Hamikdash, when they put up the 2 parochos, where was the opening of the first paroches? It was on the northern wall. So let's say that on this side of the screen is the heichal. Okay, and then they put up a screen. They put up a paroches like this, but the opening was right here. So the Kohen Gadol could right here, and then from here and down is paroches. So if that's true, so let's say that above my hand is the opening of the paroches. So Rabbi Yossi would say that he walks up on the northern wall, above all of the kelim, above the shulchan, and goes straight in. Okay, now he's into the first paroches. That's shita number 1, Pischa b'tzafon kai. The opening of the paroches was on the northernmost side of the wall. For Rabbi Yehuda was of the opinion, this was shita number 1 that we saw, that he walked between the menorah and the mizbeach on the bottom third, not against the wall, but above the menorah and in between the shulchan. That's how he said we would walk. Amar lach, he'd say pischa b'daram kai. He would say that the reason why he was walking so low above the menorah and below the mizbeach was because the opening of the parochas wasn't up here. The opening of the parochas was down here, and he had to have to walk through this little entrance right here. So he'd walk in the heichal doors, go to the south of the mizbeach, but above the menorah, and then go down into the actual opening of the first parochas. The Reb Meir, come on, Svirle. Who does Reb Meir hold like? What did Reb Meir say? Reb Meir says you walk above the mizbeach, but below the shulchan. So who does he hold like? If he holds like Rabbi Yehuda, that really the opening of the first paroches was all the way up here at the northern side, then do like him. Rabbi Yehuda. Then you should go up and enter into the Kodesh HaKodashim, just like he did, which was up against that top northern wall, above even the Shulchan. Rabbi Yossi Svirle, and if you hold like Rabbi Yossi, then do like Rabbi Yossi said. Rabbi Yossi. So says the Gemara, La'olam, really Rabbi Yossi Svirle. Amar lach shulchanis tzafon v'daram munachim. This is something that we learned about many blot ago, that there wasn't just one shulchan. There was a whole host of shulchanos in the Mikdash, built by David or Shlomo. I can't remember which one. I think they were built by Shlomo, pretty sure. Anyways, he couldn't walk all the way against that northern wall. Why? Because there was a table there. Just logistics. It just didn't work. Well, misafkale. umefaska le'shulchan v'lo mis'ayale. There, he couldn't walk up against that wall because there was a table there. Because there was a table there, he just couldn't walk. So he walked below the shulchan, but above the mizbeach, and then he would go up into that northern entrance of that first paroches. Says the Gemara, another answer is le'olam, really mizrach umarav munachem. Really, those tables were not north-south. Those extra tables that Shlomo built were not north-south. They were east-west. However, umishum shchina lav orach ara lemea lehedja top of Nunbeis Manalef. It's not appropriate, says the Gemara, according to this approach, to literally walk directly opposite the opening, above the shulchan, up against that northern wall. It's not appropriate to walk directly opposite the opening of the parocha. It's too much kedusha. For Rabbi Yossi, if it's too much kedusha for him, why isn't it too much kedusha for you? So it says the Gemara, Amar lach chavivin Yisrael shelo hitzrichan hakasiv l'shliach. No, we're close with the Kodesh Baruch Hu. We don't need to do that. And the Kohen Gadol is allowed, it's not considered a chutzpah. He's close to a Kodesh Baruch Hu, and he's allowed to walk straight into the opening at the northern side, and therefore he is absolutely allowed to do that, and that's why Rabbi Yossi allows it. Rabbi Yehuda Nami, Ne'ul Bein Menorah Lekosel. Rabbi Yehuda, if you, Rabbi Yehuda, hold that the opening of the first paroches is on the south side down here, so why did you walk above the menorah? You should walk below the menorah, walk south of the menorah, in between the wall of the menorah, the wall and the menorah, very, very close to the southern bottom, the southern part of the Heichal. Says the Gemara, we can't because of the following two words, Meshachre Maneh. Maneh, his clothing will become meshachre, will become darkened, it'll become black, basically. And we've probably seen this in some of our homes after lighting Shabbos candles, that sometimes the walls can get darkened from the smoke. And if the walls get darkened from the smoke, it could dirty his clothes, and that's not an appropriate way to go into the mikdash. So therefore, by the shita that says you walk all the way against the top, the shulchan doesn't put off smoke, no problem. By the shita that says you walk on the bottom, you cannot walk in between the wall and the menorah because the wall is going to be dark, and therefore walk above them. That explains all of the shitas. Mir Hashem, tomorrow night we'll pick up at 8:40 p.m. with Amar Rav Nassan, 4 lines down on Beis Amud Aleph. Wishing you all a beautiful night.